I know we all love Python, but if you're doing anything in web development, you end up doing some JavaScript. I do a lot of like full stack development, and I've been, I don't know, probably the past year or so doing a lot of Angular stuff. So this is the introduction to AngularJS for the Python web developer. My name is Paul Bailey. I'm a web developer. I work for Drama Fever, which is an online video site. If you like Korean dramas and international video, go check it out. It's pretty cool. And then I also have my little side project, Neutron Drive, which is a code editor. That's a Chrome app. Check that out. It's a cool little cross-platform code editor. And for both of these places, I've done an Angular app now and use Angular almost daily. So before we get started, definitely don't want to be like Angular is the cure-all for all your JavaScript problems and it's going to do everything you ever wished for. It's definitely a tool that's good for certain things. And yes, probably the new hotness with like Ember and all the new JavaScript frameworks out there. But it definitely has a use case that's very good for. You still might do some jQuery, so I put a little picture of jQuery. Is probably more like a hammer. You're going to use it a lot, and it's going to be useful for a lot of things. And then I have a little picture of a nail gun. I thought it looked like an Uzi, so I thought it was a cool picture. But so Angular is going to be a lot more powerful, but you can't use a nail gun to like hang a picture on the wall. So, you know, that would probably be a really bad idea. But, you know, if you're building like houses day in and day out, it's a really good tool for that. And Angular is the same way. Angular actually even comes packaged with a lightweight jQuery tool built into it. And if you include jQuery, it will use that instead of its lightweight version. So, yeah, don't come thinking that like, I'm going to totally trash all my jQuery code and jQuery sucks. Like, it's still a great tool. They just have different use cases for what they're good at. All right, so what's Angular good for? And I'm going to go more into all of these points here. It's good for making things that are more like an app on the web. You know, so think of like Gmail. Think of, you know, like a Google Docs or a phone app, a hybrid phone app. It's good for complex front-end interactions. It's also really good if you want to try to start testing your code on the front end more. We probably are doing our Python tests on the back end when you have unit tests. So it's good for that. It's also really good for making reusable components. You know, there's a million jQuery things that are reusable. But if you do it in Angular, it's definitely a lot more organized and kind of more compact of the API of how you reuse things. So let's go into single-page web apps. Like I said, things like Gmail, GitHub kind of. So if you ever watch when you're on GitHub and you're clicking on different files, you'll see that the whole page doesn't load. Just a portion of it will like slide in. If you're like sitting on an issue, someone updates, you'll get, without even having to refresh the page, you'll get that comment pop up. So Angular is good for things like that. Chrome apps, like I said, Neutron Drive, woo, is a Chrome app now. It's also good for hybrid apps. So if you're looking to write an HTML5 app in like PhoneGap and deploy it to Android and iOS, you can use Angular, and normally you want to package your JavaScript and your HTML locally with that app so that's faster and more responsive, and Angular really helps a lot with that. So anytime you want to like provide a more app-like experience, Angular is a good choice. Complex front-end interactions. So I have a little jQuery snippet and a little Angular snippet, and I'll show you some more snippets later. But with jQuery, a lot of times you're manipulating your HTML. And so you have a lot of HTML in your JavaScript. If we ever did that like on the back end in Python, you'd probably get laughed at a lot. Well, we do a little bit. You know, you normally have like a template, and then you have your Python code, and you try to keep your presentation and your business logic, or whatever you want to call it, controller, separated. So if you look at the jQuery example, maybe you're like getting some AJAX request, you're getting a piece of data, you're generating a table from your data, and then you're just sticking it somewhere into that page. And then maybe you're like adding a CSS class to make that viewable. Or on the Angular side, you do that same call, get your data, but just set that to whatever variable you picked. And then over here, this is the Angular template code where we have a loop. And so whenever you update that table data, Angular is going to automatically update that HTML for you. You don't have to go in and manipulate HTML. You're just updating your data, and it's getting updated when you do that. And that's what they call two-way data binding. Well, for this particular example, it's probably only one way, but you can also bind it to like inputs, form inputs, and different things like that. So like I said, it's also good for testing. So a lot of us probably do integration type testing with Selenium, you know, where we automate clicking on buttons and different things like that. If you want to start doing more unit type tests in your JavaScript, because Angular helps you to kind of break things apart, it's a lot easier to do your JavaScript unit testing that way. And lastly, reusable components. And there's other things that Angular is good at, but these are just four that I've really used a lot and liked. So here's an Angular piece of code here where maybe you wrote an autocomplete widget, and now all I have to do to put that onto some HTML form input is I just put an attribute, autocomplete. And now Angular knows to attach the autocomplete widget to that particular thing. Another example down here, if you've seen Google's material design, there's a project called Angular Material where they implement material design in Angular. And so if I wanted like this nice slider here, I just actually create a material slider tag, and then ng model tells me what variable I'm binding it to. And now whenever I adjust that slider, my JavaScript code will automatically get updated to whatever the value in that slider is. And that's a better example of two-way data binding. I could change it in my browser. You know, a user changes it, it updates the backend, the JavaScript code, or I could change it in the JavaScript, and the UI will update from that. So what about Python? This is the Python conference. So probably the sweet spot of Python is Angular, and you'll probably hear a lot at other conferences, is basically having an Angular front end and then having a Python RESTful API backend. And this is like really awesome. And so if you want to learn some more about more of the Python end of things, Sheila's giving a talk tomorrow, I guess, at 1 p.m. So she's doing a REST API one-on-one design that will go complement this talk greatly. I'm a Django guy, and if you're into Django, a good way to get started with the Django API is the Django REST framework. So you should check that out. It's a really easy way to hook up your models and create a REST API from that. So that's my one Python slide. There you go. All right, so let's talk about, my goal of this talk is not necessarily that you're going to be an Angular expert by the end of the talk, but is more of kind of introduce some of the concepts of Angular. There's just too much involved in, I couldn't just like write code and you just learn it here in this talk. So hopefully I can introduce some of the concepts. You'll know when to use Angular or when to use jQuery and what's better, so that when you go from here, you can go learn it more. So some of the concepts I'm going to talk about, looks like the extras got cut off there, but that's all right, are controllers, and that deals with the data binding and how do you update your data, and also that deals with templating. We're going to talk about directives, which is how you create those reusable components that you can use in other code, or other pieces of your UI. We're going to talk about services. So services are how you now bind your API to your front end and how they talk to each other. And we'll talk about routing. So now you're going to do a lot of your routing on the front end when people go to different URLs. You're going to do that in your JavaScript instead of on your back end. And then there are some extras, which looks like got cut off, which I'm not actually going to go over, but there's other things like localization, form validation, and there's a lot of tools in Angular that you can use. All right, so let's talk about controllers. So the first part of controllers, I basically put a snippet of the templating language, and it probably looks very familiar if you're used to like Django templating, or you're used to Jinja or anything with the brackets. It's very similar to that. And so this, you'll see at the top, is a piece of HTML code. I can show you. This is part of my editor here. So on the side here of my editor, there's a file browser, and when you click on something, you get the files in that directory. Woohoo! And so this piece of code, let's go back to the presentation here, is just a small part of that. And you can see I'm declaring my controller at the top, which is the main controller, I called it. And that tells it in the JavaScript somewhere I'm going to have defined a controller called main controller. And then I start using variables that are in that controller. So like file.name, recent files, that's all stuff that my controller is manipulating. And you can see here's a loop in Angular. So instead of like a for loop, you have an ng repeat attribute. And so I'm saying for every file in my recent files, which is just a list of files, I can attach something that happens. So ng click is obviously I'm clicking on it. So if I click on that file, something's happening. And then I'm just putting the file name right here. So now anytime I update that recent files list in my JavaScript, this HTML will automatically get generated and update on the UI. So now let's, so actually I think I showed you the wrong part of the editor. This recent files is actually this piece of the UI right here. So you can see this is the recent files list. And then if I click on something, it opens the file for me. All right, so now that's what the HTML code looks like, or what the templating looks like. So now in the JavaScript, this is what the JavaScript will look like. You're defining your controller. You can see I named it main controller. And then in your controller, you'll have a variable called scope, which is basically anything you can access now in your HTML template. So you can see I'm setting scope.recentFiles. Right now, that's in this piece of code. It's just an empty list. And then you can see it in that HTML, I had an open recent when you click on that file. That's just a function. And again, I want it available to my controller in my template. So I do scope.openRecent, and now I attach a function to it, and I can use that in my HTML. Now, when the editor first loads up, I actually save that in local storage of what your recent files are. And then I just update that recent files list. And it'll automatically render on the UI. And controllers can get a lot more complicated, like I said, but I just kind of want to introduce the idea of this is one way of how Angular separates your code for you into different pieces. So your controller works with the templating system of Angular. And so you're going to try to keep your controllers kind of skinny, because what happens is you end up putting everything in your controller because that interacts with your HTML the most. But we'll go over services and different things, because you want to try and keep your controllers, let's not go back to the same jQuery stuff where we're just lumping everything in one function. So here's another example of the controller. And this one shows off the two-way data binding. So let me show that off here. So in the editor, you have a preferences dialog. And now if I change my theme here and save it, let's go back to the code here. So you can see here in my controller, somewhere in that controller, I have a variable called form.theme. And then I have a list of themes. And so I'm doing a two-way data binding with the attribute ng model. So now anytime I update that form input in HTML, it'll automatically get updated into my JavaScript also. And this is the ng options is just a way to loop for a select drop-down. So that's how you do a for loop for your options. You can also manually just do an options tag and add some of your own options. So a lot of times you want a blank option maybe. You can just stick that in there and Angular will be fine with it. But you can also have it just loop over. So I have a list of themes, it's just looping over. And now that I bind it to my form.theme, it'll automatically update that for me whenever I select a new theme. Same thing for a checkbox. Again, I'm just using the ng model that does a two-way data binding. So now anytime I check that box or uncheck it, the variable hActive, which is my I'm highlighting code variable, will change from true to false in JavaScript for me. And it's smart enough for certain inputs, it knows what to do. So for a checkbox input, it knows that you want true or false. And for a text input, it knows you want to bind probably text to that. So. And then here's the back-end JavaScript code for that. You can see my form variable is just a map, and then I have a list of themes. This preferences variable is just a global variable I have set of all the preferences the editor supports. And so I'm going through and setting that, whatever your preferences are. And then whenever you hit save preference, this is actually a way of doing an event. I'm not going to get into that piece of it, but the variables in this controller have been updated, and I'm just letting the UI know now, hey, go update the theme. All right, so let's talk about directives. And directives are really cool. Directives can get so remember this isn't Python, so it's not going to look as pretty, unfortunately. But directives are really cool because they let you make reusable components. So a directive can be HTML tag. So like I have an example here of autocomplete. Maybe that's an input that you type in and it autocompletes for you. It can also be an attribute on a tag. So just like the previous example, I had an autocomplete. So I could write a directive that's a tag and also an attribute. And so with this example here, say I have a list of things that I wanted to autocomplete. I have a list of text that I want to autocomplete on. You can say, hey, I want this directive to have an input. And you give it a list of things. You can also do a directive for a class or a comment. I haven't really used those a lot. I don't know why you would really want to do a directive for a comment. That kind of seems weird, but the more common ones are you want to create a tag, you want to create an attribute. You can tell Angular, only use this for tags or only use this for attributes, or you can mix the two. So it's up to you. So on the front end, and this one actually comes right off the AngularJS webpage, they defined a pane. So let's go ahead and I'll bring that up so we can see what it looks like. So we've probably all used like Twitter Bootstrap, and there's like the tabs where you click on different tabs. And so if you go down here on their, see if I can find it real quick. Their pane is basically this tab interface. So instead of having to do like a lot of, like when you're doing Bootstrap, a lot of times you have to add like all these attributes and different things to say, this is what I want to do. What they built is just a tag that says this is a pane and this is a tabbed interface. So this is the beer counter controller, and that's a tab in my UI. And the directive will encase all of the extra attributes you need to do that. So like I said, the directives get a little messy. So this is an example of that directive in the JavaScript code. So because it's using like the Bootstrap core code, there's a requirement that says like, hey, I need this library, and there you go. Here's some of our nice JavaScript stuff that like you probably at first won't understand what that symbol means, but it's it's the Angular syntax. I talked about restricting. So the E means it's an element. A means it's an attribute. Again, that's just like something you'll have to learn and remember. The transclude means it can be like part of another directive, so you can have a directive in a directive, and they can share information. You can also have a directive that's part of a controller, so maybe you want to pass information between your controller and your directive. A directive, as you can see right here, can have its own scope. So maybe it has some logic and has some variables that it's just kind of keeping to itself, and you don't really care whether it's passing information back and forth. So it can have its own scope. Oops. Going ahead of myself there. You can also have a template. So you can either, I would say probably don't do this. You can put your template, your HTML right in the directive, but you can also give it a URL too. It just depends on, if you're packaging this up for other people, maybe it's easier to put your template code into this directive directly. But you can also just use a URL, and it will go fetch that HTML template for you. And I believe the replace is where it's actually like replacing HTML on the page with directive code on the page. So directives are really cool, but they are definitely, I think, one of the harder parts of Angular, of how to do them. The syntax is not very friendly. All right, so let's talk about services. And when I'm talking about services, there's three concepts in Angular. There's what's called services, there's what's called factories, and there's what's called providers. And they're each ways of talking to your back end. A service is just a one-off thing where, you know, maybe you wrote a website and you have your API, and you're never going to talk to multiple versions of your API. So you just need one service, and it's always the same thing. So it's a singleton. I'm just going to talk to my backend API. A factory is, say now, I don't know, so with like Neutron Drive, I want it to actually have multiple accounts, multiple Google accounts. So I don't want just one service. I want something that can talk to, you know, your work account and your home account. And so I want a factory because I'm going to be changing something slightly, you know, changing your ID of your Google user. And so a factory is basically a factory of services. So you're outputting services from that. And usually that's based on some input. So like with the example of Neutron Drive, it's your different Google accounts. A provider, again, that's another one you might not use too much. You'll probably use services a lot. Factories, not so much. It just depends on your app. And then provider is the same thing as like a factory, but you kind of define it up front. You say like, I'm going to have 5 services and that's it. And I can define that kind of in my code and have that ready to go. Or like a factory, you could keep on adding in Neutron Drive. Like I can add as many Google accounts as you want to input. It will just keep on making services for each one. So, and there goes my battery. I'm going to switch this one. Can you hear me? All right. They were supposed to have new batteries. So this is, I'm not going to show off factories and providers. Again, the syntax for those gets very hairy. But it's still pretty simple once you learn it. So this is for Drama Fever, I wrote an internal tool that we create our translations and our subtitles and with this tool, and it's a Chrome app so that it's cross-platform. Any of our workers, whether they're on Mac, PC, or Linux, can just download the tool and start creating subtitles for our internal interface. So this is an example of our subtitle service, and for each video that they're translating, they get a list of subtitles. And so you can see the list function is calling some URL. And so if you're familiar with jQuery, there is the AJAX, jQuery.ajax. Well, in Angular, you have $HTTP. And that's how you make AJAX calls. Now, like I said earlier, you want to try and separate your code. And if you have like your service, separate it from your controller, it'll make it easier to test. So you could potentially just stick that HTTP request into your controller and just do it there. And yeah, I've done that. I admit it. But it'd be better if you take that out and separate it, and now you have what's talking to your backend and then what's talking to your UI, and you have a separation of concerns now. So, like I said, we have 2 functions here. I have a function that lists the subtitles, and it's just making an AJAX request, getting that data, and then sending it back. Let me show you that. I'll show that off too, actually, so you can see what it actually does. Hopefully it works right. So here's our subtitling tool. I get a list of my videos. So like I showed off that service call. That service call just happened right here. If I hit refresh, it just called the back end, got a list of my videos that I work on. I don't know Korean, so I don't really translate much. And then if I click on a video, it's now going to retrieve the subtitles from our API. And this one actually has a lot of subtitles. And you can see now I've loaded all my subtitles for this particular video. And since I'm using Angular, instead of having to generate, this is just a table here. Instead of having to generate HTML code in my JavaScript, I just update my list. And subtitles is just a list. And bam, it regenerates that table for me. If I were to click this delete button, instead of having to go into my DOM and my HTML and look for that line and remove it, I just simply go into that list and remove that item. And it updates my subtitle list. I'll show it off. I'll put Big Buck Bunny in here just to show it off. So another cool thing is while I'm playing my video here, it will go ahead and take that subtitle list and you'll get the subtitles at the bottom here. All right, so that is services. Let's see, do I have any more slides on that? All right, yeah, that's services. How am I doing on time here? Okay. All right, so another topic I wanted to talk about was routing. Because you're doing your switching of your templates and different things in your JavaScript and your HTML, you're not necessarily having to call the backend. Maybe you're switching your URL and making an API call. So Gmail is a good example of this. Hopefully I don't have any bad emails in here. But this is Gmail, and you'll notice when you click on something, the URL updates, but it actually doesn't make a request, doesn't reload the whole page. It's just changing that URL so that you have something if you wanted to come back and share that. You could paste that in somewhere and Gmail will know, load this message up. So same thing with your Angular app is you can, now you don't necessarily have to use the routing, but you can use the routing so that people can share URLs. And I paste that into my browser and it takes me exactly to that piece of your app. And routing's how you do that. So routing's pretty simple. You give it a list of URLs. You say, okay, at this URL, this controller is in charge of that URL. And again, you can give it a template or you can give it a template URL. Probably want to give it a template URL so that you're separating your code into different sections. And so anytime that URL changes, Angular knows to go get this controller, and that's the boss for that URL. So again, this is part of the subtitler app. So because it's an app, you can't see the URL change. But if I go back and forth from the list to the video, that's changed the URL. And if you want to, so like with Gmail, that's an older app. You'll notice that the URL, you get the hash symbol, and that changes. If you really want to get fancy, you can tell Angular to do what's called HTML5 push state, and where you're changing the real URL of the page, and you're not just the hash part of it. So the hash part of it is really only kind of read by your browser, where if you want like a normal URL, you have to use that HTML5 push state. All right, let's get this back. So like I said, you just define some URLs. I have right here, this is the video URL. When I click on a video, and you can see this little colon. Every video has some kind of ID, so I know which video to get. And Angular will pass that ID into the controller for me. And all you need to do now to get Angular to route these things is you just do a normal anchor tag with an href. So if I do like href edit 1, it's going to load video 1 for me. If I do edit 2, it's going to try and load video 2 for me. And this is a nice little thing at the end. You can say, if I don't know the URL, just redirect me to wherever you want like the default page to be. And then here's an example at the bottom. Like I said, for this video URL, I want to get the video ID so I know which video to load. That comes in via this parameter called route parameters. And I called it video ID with camel case. So this will have an attribute on it with that same name. And that's how I know what my video ID is now. I'm putting it now so that I use that in my template. So that's routing. All right. So that's kind of like the basic concepts that I wanted to go over. Like I said, there's a lot more kind of tools and trick things that you can do with Angular. But I wanted to kind of share also some tips and tricks that I've come across, doing Python code and Angular code. And so this is some of those kind of things that might be like hard to find to Google, but they work really well. All right, so the first one is if you're using like Django and you're submitting, or any other framework that has cross-site request forgery protection, you probably have a CSRF cookie. And if you're submitting like that form to the back end, you need to include that cookie into your request. Well, normally with a normal HTML form, you would have an input, and that value would be in that input, and it would just submit it for you. Angular, you kind of have to set that up. But what you don't have to do is put that in every service call you make. You can just say, this is the default, and just always submit this for me whenever you submit a form. So that's this is how you basically set the CSRF token. And this particular one is how you would do it in Django. I highlighted these names because, depending on what you call that cookie, you would change those names accordingly. And so now every time I make an AJAX request, it's going to put that cookie in for me. You might also want to do that, maybe you have an authentication cookie or something like that that needs to get sent back all the time. That's not sent by default. All right, templates. So you probably have some Python templates, and now you're going to have some Angular templates. And you probably don't want to mix them. If you do that, it can get really hairy, especially since a lot of the Python templating languages use the brackets, and Angular uses brackets. And so I try to keep them separate. A lot of times you want to, you feel like you have to put them together because maybe you need for your search engine SEO, with Angular, right, the search engine is just going to get these brackets and there's not going to be any content filled in until Angular executes. And so for SEO, that could be bad. So you have to deal with that in some way. And maybe one way is you'll be like, well, I can just stick my two templates together and have default data in there. But that ends up getting really hairy. You end up having to switch back and forth. And is this Django template code or is this Angular template code? So one way to get it around that is to basically, you can have some kind of service that says, is this a search engine? And if it is, render my template in JavaScript and send that back. A service that I came across is called prerender.io, which will do that for you. And it's not very expensive because you're only really doing this for search engines so that they get their content pre-rendered. You don't necessarily have to do it for your user. because they're going to render it anyway when they load the page. I guess another way to pre-render would be to do it yourself. You're probably going to have to use Node.js if you want to do that, to run your JavaScript on the server. And my little icon didn't show up here, but that was a sad face, you know, since we're at the Python conference. I don't want to do that, so that's probably you know, something you might want to avoid. But you know, hey, if you like JavaScript a lot, you know, try to do that. One of the other reasons why you might end up like smashing your two templating systems together is if you ever were on like the old Twitter web interface, it would like load the page, and then it would have to make like an API call to get your data, and it would take forever. So you're like waiting there for your data to load. And so a lot of people will pre-render too for their users, just so that initial load is faster. And GitHub does that, where if you come to a new page, it's already pre-rendered. But if you click on one of the links, it only switches that page. So they do both ways of rendering things. That can be hard, since if you're using Python, like I said, you might have to use like Node.js then to pre-render things. But the way I've kind of found to get around that is to just load your initial data with the page so that you don't have to make that initial API call, and have your service check, like, is that initial data there? If it's not, do the API call. If it is there, return the data. So you kind of get a fast way of loading that initial data without having to do two requests for that same page. And then that helps you to keep your templating codes separate. All right, this is a lifesaver too. Still, even after you do all these things, you still might have some templates that have your Python templating and your Angular templating, and they're both together. So actually with Angular, you can say change the syntax for your template code. So these two calls right here will change using the brackets to using the, I don't know what these are called now, the square thingies. I've seen the people a lot of using the square brackets. I guess that's a bracket, this is a brace, there we go. So instead of using braces, use the brackets. I've seen a lot of people using this, switching it to this syntax, so it seems like a common thing people are doing. But you could really make it like anything you want. If you want to go crazy, you know, put your like cat's name in there or something like that, if you wanted to. I found this close enough but different enough that, you know, it's pretty easy to understand. All right, so like I talked about, there's a lot of extras. There's a lot of libraries with Angular that people are building. We talked about routing. We talked about, so I put routing here because like routing and cookies and animations, you don't get those actually by default, but they are part of the Angular project. You just have to go get that extra JavaScript file. They break it up for you so that, let me go ahead and click this link, so that if you really want to have, you know, if you're really concerned about performance, these are like all the different things in Angular. So by default, you just need this. This is like the core of Angular, angular.js. But depending on what you need to use, you can go ahead and include these other libraries, and they'll give you the added functionality that you need. All right, let's see, return. There's another great tool called Angular UI, which will take like Bootstrap and other common things that you want to use in your UI and give you Angular ways of doing things. You know, catch key events, different things like that. So that's a really cool library. I think actually that's written by the Angular team also. Let's go to that page. So they give you all this extra stuff that you might want to use. I've used the Bootstrap library a lot with this. And which one is that called? Oh, here we go, UI Bootstrap. So UI Bootstrap will give you all of that nice Twitter Bootstrap stuff, but packaged up in an Angular way so that you can do your accordion, your modals, and all the different widgets that Angular makes. Another cool one is Angular Material. I'd mentioned that earlier. If you're into like Google's new material design spec, I really like it because it kind of gives you that mobile app feel, and but you're writing HTML. There's another framework called Iconic, which again gives you that like, this actually looks like a mobile app instead of a website. Bootstrap is cool, but it kind of still looks like a website. You know, people are used to seeing it there, so maybe you want to try to like make it look more like an app than a website. And then I probably should have talked about testing more, but I didn't want to go down that hole because that's another talk. Karma is basically one of the ways you can run your Angular tests, so you probably want to check that out. And you can have it run either like a browser for you like Chrome, or you can hook it up to like something like Phantom.js, which is totally headless and there's no GUI, and just kind of like really automate your tests that way. So you probably want to check out Karma. That's how you can run your Angular tests really easily. And I believe actually the Angular team wrote, I don't know, maybe they didn't write this, but it's very heavily associated with Angular. All right, and so now we come to ask me questions. Anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? And then I think, do we have a microphone or not? I guess not. Okay.
So you mentioned preloading the initial data.
Yes.
But you didn't actually show how you do that.
So that would be more on your Python backend. So the way I've come up with it is, so like in a Django app, I'll call that, I'll just make that call to that view, and then so I don't have to make a request. And I have like a variable called like initial data, and it looks for that. And then I'm not making 2 requests now.
But then aren't you using the Django template and the Angular template at that point?
Well, so if you use Django REST framework, you can have it serialize the data for you to JSON. And so, yes, you are, but it's very minimal. So you'll end up mixing them, but really the main point is like try to keep that really minimal if you can. So, you have a question back there?
What is the best way to share information between controllers?
So
If they're not nested.
yeah, so there's a couple ways to do that. Actually, one of the ways, and I didn't really go into it, was in my code snippet. So number one, you can see on that slide, there's a thing called root scope. There's actually a scope for just the app. You could, yeah, so you could use that. Yeah, you probably don't want to. Another way, again, I didn't really go into it, was right there. So you can have events. So in this particular one, I have 2 controllers. Like I had that preference controller that popped up and that dealt with that modal. And then when you hit the save button, I just say, hey, here's the new preferences. I'm emitting event. And now something is listening to that event. Another controller is listening to that event and gets that new data now. Another way is, you could make services that talk to controllers and stuff like that too. I kind of like the event model because a lot of times I'm pressing a button and now I want another controller to know that to go do something. So, and in those events, emits an event, and then if you want to watch that event, I want to say it's just watch, but you can pass any, so I'm passing the event name, and then you can pass any data with that. So I can just load up a bunch of stuff in there. Pass
So,
it.
I mean, you're using root scope at that point, but you're doing it in a more controlled way.
Yes, yeah. Because now I'm just saying, listen to this event. And the other controller is just listening for that same event and getting that data.
So the other controller just in the root scope, so that's why you're using root scope?
Well, so it's just easier, instead of making events like on all your controllers, then you have to try and hook up those controller events to each other, which can be hard. I usually just put all my events on the root scope.
Okay.
And so the root scope ends up like acting almost like a service kind of, or I'm just passing events back and forth. But the actual watch tag is not in the root root scope code. That's in the other controller. So I like seeing that controller, like I'm
Yeah, the
listening to
controller has
that.
to register, I'm interested in this function will call.
Yeah. So.
The other question I had is, does Angular come with any built-in range documentation process?
For documenting REST APIs?
No, for authentication.
Oh, for authentication? I don't think there's like necessarily anything like built in other than it's like, it's not too hard to do, but there's not like anything like specific. I mean, you can come up, it's pretty easy. Actually, that was another piece of code that was in there that I didn't go through with the services. You can see that's my token that I'm passing into the REST API. So that's how I do, for this particular app, how I did the, and it's kind of annoying because I have to add token to every request. So there are ways like that, like the cookie trick I showed you, that you could just set that as a default parameter.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, well, have fun learning Python.